Cool. Well, guys, welcome to the session. I appreciate everyone showing up after lunch on the last day of TechEd. My name is Richard Azariga, and I'm here with
Nathan Miller.
And we're going to talk to you guys about advanced patterns in cloud-hosted apps for SharePoint. So just out of curiosity, who here is a SharePoint developer? Show of hands. Who here is never done any SharePoint development, but just kind of curious about the topic? Okay, cool. Excellent. Also, just a show of hands, who here has their organization in SharePoint Online? No one? Everyone's on on-prem?
Yeah, one.
Okay. All right, cool. Well, what we're going to do today is walk you through some interesting things that we've done in the cloud-hosted app space. We've put together a pretty extensive solution and want to go through some of the different patterns and practices that we went through and lessons learned from doing something like that. So some of the session objectives, we want to discuss some complex challenges of delivering cloud-hosted apps. We want to demonstrate advanced patterns and practices in the new app model, and hopefully illustrate a solution that can really leverage the full breadth of the new app model. So we, not only SharePoint apps, but also even touching some of the Office apps that dovetail nicely into some of these solutions.
And on this session, we've got some code, but we're also going to focus really more on the concepts of, decisions that we had to make, how we hosted it, how we actually did some multi-tenancy models and things like that.
That's right. So I mentioned, for those that got here early, we do have some interesting giveaways. So Bind Tuning, they make some really neat themes for SharePoint and Office 365. Oh, let me go back one. And we actually have 2 of these to give away. You can basically go configure an entire branding package with their solution, and we'll give you guys a chance to win those. So it'll be based upon, if you have some good questions at the end, we'll kind of pick to give away a couple of these. And it's I think a $400 value each. This thing keeps going ahead. It's wanting to see help desk. So today we're gonna focus the entire conversation around a solution that we developed called Help Desk. And this is something that the product group came to Nathan and I and said, we need some really good examples to show the provider-hosted app model and be able to deal with things like tenancy and things like securing different services in different ways that might be in a cloud-hosted scenario. And so we developed a really, I think, a comprehensive solution to deliver those objectives. And so we're going to go through kind of the entire solution throughout the course of this session today, stopping in different areas, but again, we're going to kind of focus around this help desk solution and see how this was put together.
So the first thing that we're going to talk about is how we actually did some of the tenancy and the decisions that we made on that. Greg, you want to explain the picture on that one?
So I just thought this was a kind of a funny picture of, drawing the line. I don't know if you had siblings growing up where you got in a fight and you wanted to draw a line across the house and say, this is your side, this is mine. One thing I guess we should talk about when we talk tenancy is the new app model. One of the opportunities with that is to actually have apps in the marketplace. So we have an entire marketplace where you can go buy apps. And that was kind of something that we kept in mind throughout this. This app isn't in the marketplace currently, but we wanted to keep that in mind that, hey, we might have 1,000 different companies downloading our app and using it. How do we deal with that? And that's kind of what tees up this slide.
So in this application, what we had kind of make the decision on is when our application installs, is this the first time it's installed for this customer? Is it the first time it's installed? And the customer in our case was actually an instance of SharePoint, a company that's running SharePoint. But in your case, it actually might just be a different department. So there might be multiple departments that you have to do some initialization for. And so what we had to decide on was, okay, when we fire up the app and we establish the tenant for that application, does it make sense to actually spin up just another copy of that database, and that's where we're going to keep that data for that tenant? And if you went to my earlier session, that's kind of how the auto-hosted applications work, is they'll fire up a database kind of per instance of the application install. So in this case, we went back and forth on what makes sense, and it really came down to this decision of security. Do we need to keep all the data in its own database and kind of have that live somewhere? versus ease of management, and then also cost. So us being not having a lot of resources, we decided that it makes sense to have a shared model where we're actually splitting the tenant within our model. So the other thing that we had to decide on was web application. Does it make sense to have kind of vanity URLs or a website per? In our case, it really didn't. It really made sense to have one website, one set of web services, and basically have that tenant ID passed or actually retrieved each time they made calls into the application so that it called into their views on side of that application. So again, it really came down to cost versus security, and we'll kind of show you what decisions we made and how that kind of looks in the data model as well as kind of in the services that we called up. Okay. So I'm going to go through kind of how we actually provision. So we're starting this application. We're going to go through kind of the install and provisioning and how we actually kind of went from the beginning, and then we'll kind of go into the application itself. So what I've got on my screen, on our screen, is we've got our help desk application. So in here, we've got a provider-hosted model. So what that means is I've got a SharePoint application that basically is my hook for the help desk, where we've got some web parts and we've got some Excel applications as well. But we have actually a website. So it's just a .NET website where we've got actually a few web services as well. And in the application, if you haven't done application kind of event receivers, you'll notice down here in the handle app install, down in the property window, when as soon as you turn that on in this new application model, it actually sets up a web service to handle application install. And so that's what code we're in right now. So whenever I install an application, I can execute code to go do lookups, to go do provisioning. And in this case, what we're doing is we're actually provisioning that database.
It's almost like a feature receiver.
That's right. Yeah, it would be like a feature receiver that's calling a website, basically, or web service. All right, so I'll go ahead and run into debugging. And I've got a breakpoint in this app install event receiver. If you go into this model and you do need to do overrides or debugging of these event receivers or the app events, what you end up needing to do is there's actually a blog about it, but basically what you need to do is actually connect to Service Bus. So that way it can actually attach to the debugger regardless of where it's at. So I'll go ahead and trust the application.
For those that are SharePoint developers, is anyone unfamiliar with Service Bus? So just really quickly, Service Bus is a service within Azure, and it ultimately lets me proxy through. So we can actually call a local host web service from out in the cloud, and that's what we're able to do with that.
Yeah, so what we've got, so it's actually doing the install right now, and just to kind of show you this, so there's basically this app event receiver service. So that actually, whenever you start up an app install, app uninstall, it actually puts this web service out here. So you notice that I've attached to it, I've actually stepped through this, and some of the things that we've got to do is, first off, whenever that app gets installed, so when I go into my add apps and I do an install, we actually go out there and look to see, is this actually a tenant that we've had before? So I get my client context from SharePoint, I'm loading up the current website, and then from there I'm actually getting the current user. And we're going to make the assumption the first time this gets installed for a given tenant, we're going to assume that's going to be the admin that we're going to register for our application. So I'll actually make a service call. And then what we want to do is we want to create the tenant. So what we do is we do a check to see if that tenant exists. We'll go ahead and create a tenant. And then we actually make a check on the tenant ID. If it's 0, we actually say, okay, they're already registered. If not, we go ahead and create the table structures for that tenant. And just to kind of show you what that looks like, pull up our data. So I've got my Azure database here, where this website's actually running in Azure right now. And I'm actually even using the database, an Azure instance of a database for debugging as well. It just makes it easier for me to have in Azure as opposed to kind of local instance. But you'll see on here, I've actually got my tenant. It got registered. It's got it's a retail scd.sharepoint.com. I also have another tenant that I'll use later on, which is Bootcamp. And so this is what we end up registering. We also actually register a couple of other settings that we need just to actually have the application fire up and run. So we've got some configuration settings that we run in our settings database. And the way we load those up is we have a tenant default table. And what we do is anytime we actually do an install, we say, is this content, we use this for demo content as well as a regular install content. And what ends up happening is on load of a tenant or creation of a tenant, we actually create and execute all these SQL parameters with that tenant ID in it to load up any of the database tables that we need for our tenant to actually exist in our data structures.
So basically that install, it put a tenant record in a tenant database, and then it went and did a bunch of other like data things for that tenant.
That's right. It just looped through that basically a bunch of SQL commands to actually load up everything that that tenant needs to actually execute on the application.
So after we go past installing, the next thing that we wanted to address was the concept of trials. So again, if I'm targeting something for the store, the marketplace is going to support things like a trial. So I can, we actually have APIs inside of CSOM to be able to go and do checks for, let me go get all of the licensing information for this tenant. And I can go get that licensing information, and it'll bring back things like you're in a trial, you're a free user, you're a paid user. And based upon that, as the app developer, I can use that logic in any way I want within my app. So for a free user, I might want to limit the functionality. Maybe you can only create up to 1,000 help desk tickets and then you're capped. Or maybe I want limited functionality where you can't do some of the survey components that you guys will see later inside of this. So we want to keep that in mind. The other thing is getting started. For a complex application like this, and I don't think this is a SharePoint app thing. This is just a flat-out building software thing, right? We want to make it very, I like to use the term Disney simple. I want to make it Disney simple for my end user to go through and get it configured to the point where they can use this software. And so what you'll see is when I jump over to the app, now that he's installed it, we're actually going to present the user with kind of a wizard to help get started. And it's going to go through and capture things like, well, who are your engineers? What sort of categories do you want for tickets? Those are the sort of things that we're going to do. The other thing is, because we're Microsoft, we like demoing our technology. We wanted to make it very easy to set up the demo within seconds, to where I can just click two things and I have like a full filled out help desk application for me to be able to demonstrate. We also thought this was really key for people that might want to download a trial. I might want to have that kind of preloaded with some data so I can see how the application works and not have to wait several days for things to build up for the application to actually be useful. So it's kind of like a software evaluation tool in a lot of ways is loading some demo data. So what we did is, first of all, since a help desk always is going to have users associated with it, a user opens a ticket, a user works a ticket, a user closes a ticket, what we did from a demo data perspective is allow you to quickly select some users, and then we run a bunch of script on the back end that's going to go and populate some sample data. It'll give some sample alerts, sample tickets, things like that behind the scenes. And again, we felt like that was a really key thing to make this easy to use. Just to give you guys a little bit of background, the reason that Help Desk was created, I don't know if anyone remembers the old Fab 40 templates that were part of MOS 2007. So it was like 40 templates that we gave you that kind of did some things. Well, Help Desk was one of those. And
it was the most popular.
It was the most popular. We actually had an MVP that tried to do this into the app model. And it actually, he did a good job, but one of the things that was challenging is when someone else at Microsoft wanted to demo it, it was like rocket science getting it all set up. You had to have very specific users, and you had to do all this technical gymnastics to get it all working. We wanted it to where someone can be up and running within seconds, and that's what you'll see here. And it applies both for demoing from like an internal perspective as evangelism, but also if I want to like test drive things before we buy. So let's take a look at that.
7.
So I'm going into the application. You can see it's stopping me here. It's saying, do you want help getting started? We can populate your tenant with some sample data. And that's what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm going to click the yes check mark to do that. Now what it's going to do now, it's actually loading a page that's going to allow me to select users in different ways. So I can either select demo users by people that I follow, by users that follow me, or we actually have a people picker in here where I can go pick specific users. So again, from the just really quick way of getting this set up, I might say, well, I want to go with people that I follow.
And And I think another important thing here is when you're building applications, think about kind of some of the things that your end users are doing. So in corporations, a lot of times, the colleagues or the people that are following are going to be within the team. So if you've got, say, for example, some type of collaboration application or some type of application where they're doing something with other coworkers, using the social feeds or using some of the things that are already built into SharePoint is all that we're doing here. So we're hooking into those and actually pulling that into our application.
That's right. I think another kind of key thing here that is, hopefully you're noticing it, is you might say, well, you got pictures there, names and things like that. So we're already showing here from the very get-go the value of having an app like this integrated with SharePoint. I'm actually going and exploiting profiles, right? So when I installed this app, I don't know if you noticed it when Nathan did the install, it stopped. All of these apps are going to say, here are the permissions that this app wants. It's part of the whole OAuth permission check that we go through. And one of those was reading permissions. We do a lot of integration in this app, but profiles is one of those. So we're able to pull those profiles. We're able to go and look at who your followers and who you might be following. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify this just because I don't need quite that many users. Let me just go and we'll go with that. That's pretty good. We'll go with those 5. So now this is going to go and crank off for a while. Not that long. It takes only about probably, 10 to 20 seconds. But behind the scenes, what this is doing, it's putting, I would say, almost hundreds of records into the database. It's doing things like, it's going to go ahead and seed my application with ticket categories. It's going to put some engineers in there. It's going to create a bunch of demo tickets, alerts. All of that's automatic, and again, it's part of that trial experience. So now my page is going to refresh, and now we're into the application. If I want to see what that did behind the scenes, obviously you can see some alerts here are already created, but let me jump into settings. So here are some of my engineers that I have created. So if I wanted to delete Ali, I can go delete Ali. I can do, here's where I can use that people picking capability again if I wanted to add maybe Robin. You can see I can go and actually do like real lookups in here, and when I add Robin, again, it pulls in all that profile information. So very, very rich. I mean, it feels like when you're in SharePoint doing these things. We wanted that user experience to be very similar. Ticket categories, another good example. I have a number of ticket categories here. I can add my own. We thought it would be cool from a visual standpoint to be able to color code categories so I can do all kinds of interesting sorting. So, if I don't like the green color here, I can go and maybe pick a different color here. I'll go with like a different, like pink, and I can do that. So here you're seeing, again, the rich profile integration. Here's an area where we're integrating SharePoint with things like the managed metadata. So I can actually, there's kind of a neat thing in here where I can subscribe to different terms that might, as an engineer, help me identify issues of systems. So I would guess that just about everyone here at some point during the week had Wi-Fi issues. Am I right? Yeah, so I might want to do things like subscribe to network. So I'll say network. I'll add a few more. Maybe I'll do Outlook. Add link. And again, this is going and it's looking up an actual term in a managed metadata service inside of SharePoint. Again, that's one of those permissions that we requested. So let's do SharePoint. I'll just do a few more. Do Office and Windows 8. And I'll show you why I'm adding some of these. There's a neat feature that we added to this. The last thing that we have in settings are some default SLAs. So we have 4 different ticket levels. So I have a low priority, a normal priority, a high priority, and a critical. And what we want to do is set an SLA for that. So maybe critical tickets need to be closed in 30 minutes. High tickets have maybe 60 minutes, normal is 120. But I can tweak those around. And actually, I'll show you here in a little bit how that actually is reflected in the user experience. So tickets that are exceed the SLA will start blinking and turning green to show an engineer, you need to work on this quickly. One thing that's cool is we really, and I'll talk about this, the user experience a little bit later, but we wanted to have a very rich experience for even things like saving. So behind the scenes, we've just kind of locally cached all of those changes that I made. So when I leave, it'll actually say, hey, do you want to save these or not? And so what I'll do is I'll actually come back here and save my changes. So now that's saved, I can do some other things in here. So first of all, let me maybe show you how we're using things like these keywords. So all these keywords, what we do is we have an activity feed as an engineer. I can come in here and I can look for any time those different keywords are mentioned. And we're putting some sentiment analysis on it. So as an engineer, I can quickly maybe look here once a day and go look for things that are red and maybe identify issues that I need to go work. Sentiment analysis isn't perfect, but again, it's just another tool as an engineer that I can use. So I'm going to let Nathan kind of walk you through some of the additional components of the help desk application, some of the ticketing and alerts, but hopefully this shows you how some of that default data can really accelerate a user in getting started with your application.
Yeah, and I'd say on the sentiment analysis, what's neat about this is it's just using search. So again, we're using SharePoint search based on anything that actually has a hashtag in it, and then we're actually able to run a secondary kind of check to see if that was a positive or negative comment. So that's something that can actually be useful outside of this. But in this case, in this kind of storyline, what we thought was, people will actually might be complaining about a certain service that we've got or an application, and we actually may want to create an alert based on that. So I'll actually go into my tenant, and you'll see I can actually go in here and just create a simple alert. So again, we try to keep the screens very simple, whether it's ticketing or alerts. So in this case, this would be an engineer that would actually create this alert. So we'll say Wi-Fi issues in conference, under network. There are some issues. Where's location? New Orleans. And what do we got, like 8,000 here, 9,000? Yep, go ahead and hit OK. So we've got alerts, we've got ticketing in there. Okay. And so this will allow us to have alerts, surface up in a web part that we'll show you later, but we also have alerts that we can go in here and kind of quickly go through alerts. We can also create tickets, so I'll go ahead and open a new ticket. And we'll say this is networking. Okay. So a couple things that we do with the ticketing that might be interesting is, first off, we've got the priorities that you see. So we always start everything with a average priority. We don't actually elevate anything. A lot of our users think everything's kind of high priority, and then we got to figure out which is the highest priority. The other things that we do is that SLA. So we actually have an SLA duration on each thing that we've got. And we can do things like assign to. In this case, I'll actually just assign it to me so I can close it out. But we also do things like looking up address location based on browser. So all browsers nowadays can actually do geolocations. So we can actually do that real time and kind of figure out what we can do without having to prompt the user with a lot of these things. So if we can get close enough for our users' requirements, let's go ahead and do that and kind of let the technology work for us. The other thing that we do is you'll notice that we've got kind of add a comment where we've got that site feed, news feed type of feature in here.
So if Nathan were working on this ticket and maybe reassigning it to me, he might say, hey, I ordered some parts, but you're responsible for putting those in when they get in. It just gives him the ability to put some activity in there that I can come back and look at later.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we decided was certain types of activity feeds, we actually want to sync to the person's news feed. So we may actually want to sync every type of activity feed that we record here, so they don't have to keep coming back to the app to kind of see updates of their tickets. But in this case, what we decided was, whenever we close out a ticket, we'll actually post up in the activity feed that we've closed or we've changed the ticket status. That way, again, in their news feed, we're kind of using social in a couple of different areas there. Okay. So let me go ahead and save this. Oh, this is me? Yep. Yeah, so some of the things that we looked at on the data services side, what we decided was everything is going to basically be REST-enabled services. And one of the core reasons why we decided to use REST was because we can use that same pattern for our WCF services as well as our SharePoint services, and then the UI developer didn't have to really change patterns on anything. The other thing that we decided was both of us really like entity model. So on top of our database, we decided to actually leverage entity model as well. And I'll actually just kind of show you what that looks like real quick. Okay.
Just curiosity, who here is more of a ASP.NET developer versus an MVC? Who's ASP.NET? Who's more of an MVC person? Cool. Who's a different web technology person? Okay, that's good. Got one in the front there. But the neat thing is you could use any of those. We do most of our logic is all client side. There's a little bit. In fact, it really wouldn't matter ASP.NET or MVC in our case. But you have that flexibility in this new app model with SharePoint. You haven't had that in the past.
So just a couple things to kind of quickly point out. One of the core things that we did was we decided that basically we'll have a tenant identity. So I showed you kind of how tenant gets loaded, but everything off of our model has to filter off a tenant. So basically everything in the model, whenever we do a get tenant is the first thing we do. And the other thing that we decided was that we would actually never make a call to have the client pass that. What we didn't want to do is have JavaScript call and say, hey, this is the company I am, because it just doesn't make sense. They can actually pass whatever company they want, and we'd give them data back for it, right? So what we wanted to do is server side, we wanted to say, hey, let's actually, using SharePoint OAuth, let's actually check to see where did this person come from, and basically we did a server validation on any of the REST calls to our services, even though they were actually being called through Java or JavaScript. So on our data services, we basically have a help desk set of data services, and if you notice on here, we basically use the default contracts. So that everything was basically a web get. So I can actually get my tenant information from the client side, but I can't actually tell it which tenant I'm coming from. We determine that, again, through our OAuth security model. And then also, you'll notice that on get tenant, we always check to see if it's authenticated. So we want to make sure that the user's been authenticated to our SharePoint site before we ever actually serve up any data, because these are web services. They could be called out from other applications or other things. So you got to make sure that it actually is a secured connection before you actually serve up any data for that given user. So a couple other things just to be aware of. So like I said, we switched to SQL Azure. Richard's actually running it on localhost databases. I've actually run it on a SQL Azure database, even in debug mode. The one thing to be aware of, there's a couple slight differences, but not much difference at all. In fact, the only difference I noticed was there was actually a connection, multiple connection settings, but it is something to be aware of. So even though you test it locally, if you move to a SQL Azure or a different version of SQL Server, make sure that some of those entity calls are working the way you expect them to, because between 2008 R2 and 2012, there might be some slight tweaks to that difference that might cause you some challenges as well. Yeah, and we already talked about the Rust enabled as well.
All right, so on the UI and branding, first of all, we do a lot in client side. We wanted to have that to be a very kind of immediate model. So we do, most of that's one of the reasons why we went with a REST approach with our services. So it's, for the most part, there are multiple pages in the application, and I'll talk about that. But for the most part, you're staying on one big page, and we're just doing different REST calls to change the UI as we're working through the application. I know that in terms of how a browser sees JavaScript, it's all kind of one big island of script, but from an organization standpoint, we did organize it into kind of 4 primary files. So we have a common JavaScript file that basically has different utility type things. We have a data which has all of our basic AJAX calls back to the services. We have a UI to where we're building things. So we did a lot of kind of UI controls in there, like the people picker and color pickers and things like that. And so a lot of that's encapsulated in that helpdesk.ui. And then we have a templates one because we do a lot of dynamic. Well, I'm going to add a new list item, and so that HTML, we kind of have it in a templates area to where I can just go call and get templates. From a branding standpoint, I'll be honest with you, we went back and forth on this forever. We really, as we were evaluating, one of the first things comes to mind is use the Chrome control or don't use the Chrome control. So I'll be honest, we actually redid the UI of this app 3 times. I completely built it and then said, no, I don't like that, let's do it a different way. So first we did it with its own unique brand, and then we said, no, we need to do the Chrome control. And we did the Chrome control, and we said, no, it makes sense if you're building an app, especially for something like the marketplace, that go ahead and brand it the way you want, right? I mean, if you have a brand, I think it's totally acceptable to do that. Now, you do need to fit within the boundaries of what an app needs, so we do absolutely recommend that you have a link back to the host site. So you can see at the top of the screen there's a little Office 365 button. If I click on that, it takes me back to my SharePoint site we thought that that was pretty important to do. Another thing is when this application was originally built, the developer, and we completely redid it, but when he did it, he had a native mobile app, and it happened to be a Windows Phone one. And I'm not naive. I know that there's probably some Windows Phone users in the audience, but I guess there's probably a lot of Android and iPhone users. And instead of trying to say let's build a native app for everything, what if we built our app in a way that delivered a responsive design? So anyone have experience doing responsive UI? Awesome. So that's the same approach that we wanted to take here, so that if I have it on my normal PC, it looks great. But if I were to bring it up on my phone as well, it's going to automatically adjust and look good on there. So that's kind of the approach we wanted to take with that. The other thing that we decided we wanted to do was make sure that we do, even though that if you're familiar with the different kind of ways that we can do apps for SharePoint, we're in a full screen app, what we call a full screen app. We actually go outside of SharePoint and then just have hooks back into SharePoint. One of the other things that's really popular in the new app model is what's called an app part. It's basically a glorified page view or web part. And we wanted to have those where it made sense. So things like alerts or maybe my tickets. We wanted to be able to have those available so that if I was just on like the IT site, I could show alerts right there on the IT site, and then if I needed to work on those alerts or get more detail, then maybe I jump into the actual application. And so what you'll see is we'll show you examples of that to where we can still surface some of that data from our application in SharePoint, and it works nice both ways like that.
Yeah, so we kind of talked about the get tenant, and we kind of showed that already. The other thing that we've got is user versus engineer. So we also wanted to basically detect which type of user it was when they came in. With applications today, when you look at the SharePoint application model, there's kind of two ways to do that. So basically, you get an OAuth token-based capacity that has current user. And a lot of the existing applications that are running right now are basically using SQL security. So we've taken a step back when you look at roles and security models. That's changing rapidly, though. And if you're on-premise, you actually have the ability to query ADFS, or you have the ability to query Active Directory and get additional groups and roles and security on top of that. Also with 365 going forward, with the Azure AD stuff, if you guys attended any of those sessions, we have that ability now in the cloud as well. So that's kind of a new capability that's kind of just come around in the last couple months. But essentially what you're looking at is how do we actually control security levels? We did the people pickers. Richard mentioned that. And then also on the post-back only operations. So basically, let's not expose the REST services outside of the tenant. And then there's several types of methods where we actually didn't want to expose those methods at all. So like, for example, the reset tenant, the load demo data, we wanted to do that server-side completely. So don't even make a service call, even if they're exposed. We would actually make that call from either the event trigger or from the code behind for those particular service calls.
Awesome.
What's that? Which one? Yours?
Yep. So I want to go through now that we've kind of walked through some of the different architectural areas, so kind of the back-end services and database, some of the front-end things like UI, responsive design, and security. I want to walk through some of those so you can see what that looks like. So here is just a regular wiki page on a SharePoint site, and you can see that we have our help desk data that we're pulling in here. Hopefully, if you've seen things around app parts, you know that for app parts, we want to try to bring some of the styling of that site in. So because we don't want it to look obvious that it's an iframe, right? That was my biggest concern when I heard about these. Look like a world of iframes. So we can go and pull in styles from the SharePoint side in order to make our app part look similar. We can even resize it. So you can see here, this is a dynamic thing, right? And if it's an iframe, well, how am I going to let that iframe grow as new alerts get created? So what's neat this speaks to the interactivity we can have between app parts and SharePoint, is I can actually do what's called a post-message resize. I can post a message from my app out to the main SharePoint parent that's hosting my iframe and say, resize by this much. And that's what we're doing here. So as I add new alerts, I can actually resize it and make it look good here so it doesn't have scroll bars show up. So I talked about the responsive design, so I'll show you that here really quickly. So here's my normal page, and what I thought I'd do is I have it in the modern UI browser, and when I do a snap, let me just refresh it here. So you can see that I get a nice UI that, it wraps. We did a lot of design around ULs, having everything in an unordered list. And we tried to be really strategic. As you look through the app, really strategic around about a 320 pixel width. So we didn't have to do a lot of resizing. As it gets smaller, the 320 pixel sections can just stack on top of each other. So like the settings page, all of those different items were exactly 320 pixels, and so they just stack as it starts to resize. Even the dialogues, we were really strategic around this. When I do new ticket, notice that it all works within that. That's kind of the minimal width that we wanted to design for, was 320, because that's most of the modern mobile browsers these days do that. So that's some of the responsive design that we did. Talked about the concept of being able to do reset. So I think that was a key thing that we wanted to provide in the app. So I'm going to jump over here. I'll go ahead and reset this tenant. I'll go ahead and click into the app. And you can see, we warn you here, but at the bottom, we give you the ability to reset the help desk. We did this for two reasons. One is, if you're one of those trial users and you're like, hey, this is good, I want to use it for real, let me purge all that data out of the application and start over. The other reason we did this was, actually, we keep track of tenants over time, so if you were to completely uninstall the app and come back in, we preserve your data. We felt like that was an important thing to do, was to preserve your data. And so if we preserved it and you actually don't want it, you could come back and reset it. So when I do this, when I click reset here, it's warning me, are you really sure you want to do this? And when I do that, it's going to go off and finally execute. Now, here's the key thing here. Everything you've seen me do for the most part has been client-side. It's all been client-side things. We felt that like really big things like that, like resetting your entire tenant, I didn't want to expose that in any way in like a client-side REST service. That just didn't seem secure to me. So cases like that, we are doing full postbacks so that we can do additional server-side checks that we might need and to make that a little bit secure. So things like resetting the tenant, loading demo data, none of that happens client-side. That happens with a postback. So that kind of speaks to that security screen that Nathan showed. And then the last thing that I wanted to show you was the different roles. So you can see here I'm logged in as Richard, the boss, and I have another user that's using the help desk, but they happen to be just a normal user. So Robin here is just a normal user, and you can see she doesn't have the full app available to her. She can see tickets and go, or alerts and go see different alerts. She can see things like tickets and be able to create tickets. Actually, she has none created right now, but she can go and create tickets. She can look at the history, which would be tickets that she's done in the past. So here's one that she had a while back, and she can go look at the details of that. However, she doesn't have some of the more administrative things that a normal engineer would have. So like activity and the unassigned task or the queue. She's only going to be able to see tickets that are assigned to her. So that's some of the permissions that we wanted to build into the application. Cool.
Yep, sure. So the other thing that we wanted to do was we talked about we talk a lot about Office apps and how they can actually integrate with the SharePoint applications. And what we found was mail apps are one of those great applications where after you've created a process or after you've in this case created a ticket, you actually might want to have a mail app. And so instead of actually having an email sent out and then kind of looking at what's the latest email, what's the latest status of it, well, that's a great opportunity where you can actually use a mail app to actually call back into your application and get real-time status of it. So you don't have to track down 10 different emails based on every time it updated. I actually can always get the latest status just by using my mail app. So that's actually one of the things that we decided to do was look at really kind of leveraging mail app and how would we do that. Well, when we did that, not just the mail apps, but the Office apps in general, we needed to actually look at what types of project structures would we do. So, we have to make the call on, does the application, live on its own, or should the application live as part of your SharePoint project? And it really kind of comes down to probably your development cycles of how often are you going to update the SharePoint app? What are the dependencies? In our case, our dependencies are actually our services. We have a services set, we have an entity model, and our mail apps, so we have an Excel app, all that actually uses the same model as well. So the one thing I will say, though, if you do actually go into develop mail apps, instead of actually kind of focusing on starting with the mail app, maybe what you want to do is focus on the UI and the application itself, and then actually pull it into the mail task panel after you do the development. And the reason why is because it actually, every time you have to connect and deploy to a mailbox, so actually building out the HTML pages and the web pages and the applications, it makes it actually much more faster development if you actually just build that, get that working, and then actually pull that into a web app. So we'll go ahead and take a look at our mail apps. So in our case, like I said, I created that ticket earlier. And what you'll see is we have a mail app for ticket status. So mail apps are actually triggered based on subjects by send to addresses. What this does is actually calls back into our service. We actually get the real-time status of that ticket. So we get ticket number, we get our job, we get who it's assigned to. And again, if that ever gets updated, I don't have to go direct on different emails. I can actually go always into the last one.
I think there's something really key here, too, I want to point out is, you notice that it's showing Nathan's picture there under assigned to. Again, that's actually coming from SharePoint. So there's a really interesting thing going on here. We're not in SharePoint at all, yet we're using our SharePoint app. So what we're actually doing behind the scenes is something called an app-only call. If you've ever been into the app manifest for an app, there's this, under the permissions tab, there's a checkbox that says, I want my app to be able to do app-only calls. And what this means, think of it as kind of like a timer job almost, right? A timer job isn't a user running, it's its own process running and it needs to do things. And think of our mail app as a timer job. Our mail app, no context of SharePoint whatsoever, needs to go and get like a profile picture. So it's making what we call an app-only call to go and say, hey, I need to get profile information for this person. Well, I guarantee you our database is not storing even a display name for a user. We just have their login name stored behind the scenes. So we're going, again, making that SharePoint call, getting their picture, their profile picture, and getting that name.
So the other mail app that we thought would actually make sense in this case, and actually we built this out to be a Fuller-based application, is a survey application. And so if you see in here, what we decided was whenever you close out a ticket, it might make sense to actually survey to see how that experience went. But when you think about kind of surveys and email responses, that's actually a more generic term than also just maybe a help desk. So what we decided to do is actually build out a full survey engine. So what we do is we key off of survey, and then in this case, we're actually just saying, let's pull up the help desk survey. But it really is something that corporate communications could very easily use. Where they actually might have, a survey they want to get how was benefit enrollment this year. So they can actually send out an email. It actually, if it starts with survey, and then it will actually go look up to see what survey that mail message is queued up for, and it actually pulls up all that stuff from the database. I can actually take the full survey from my email client. I don't have to actually go out to a link. I could actually just do it all straight here. So I'll go ahead and say yes. We have a few questions in here. Can go back to the last one. Back. How many days was it open for? And then what was your rating? So in this case, we'll say excellent. So certainly when you guys are filling out your evals, maybe this would be how we might want to fill out that eval as well. And we also have like open comments. So I just put 2 or 3 different types of questions in here. But again, you kind of see the benefit of how a mail app might actually be able to augment some of your current processes or some of your different applications that you have today. That's right. And the reason why I wanted to use a SharePoint survey, the reason why I didn't was there was no good way to actually no good way that I could find to put a survey inside of the SharePoint app web. So if you look at the templates of lists that you can put in there, survey wasn't one of them. So what we decided to do was just put basically a survey engine in the database. We could have actually used a generic list and maybe done it off of lists and answers. But we already had an entity model that kind of tied everything together, so we thought that that was probably the more appropriate place for our services. So anyway, I went ahead and thanks me for it, and I can go ahead and close that out. So again, just kind of how Mail Apps can augment and add functionality so that the user doesn't have to keep going back into the application, or can actually have a very useful, good experience just from the email, the context that they're currently in. Oh, sorry, 7 or 1.
All right, so the next thing that we wanted to do was have reporting capabilities, right? I think it's important that when you do things like a help desk, you have reporting. And if you look at kind of Microsoft's strategy for reporting, it really centers around Excel. There are other reporting things that we have, but if you look at kind of our modern BI things, it's kind of built on Excel. Things like Power View and Power Pivot and even GeoFlow, those are all really neat things that fit into Excel. And so we wanted to kind of cater to that approach, right? We want to be able to use those tools with it. So we thought right off the bat, let's try to use Excel as our reporting engine. And so that's kind of the approach that we decided to take. So one thing that we ran into really early on in building this was the concept of identity and context. When I open an Excel document, if you go and look at the object model that we have in the Web Extensibility Framework of these new Office apps, there's really nothing that gives you like a user or an identity of in any way. So the next thing we said was, well, what is available? And what we did find is that I can get the location of where the document lives. So we thought, you know what? I bet if we put this document in SharePoint, we could get tenant information from it. So that's exactly the approach that we took, is that we actually deploy an Excel document into the app web and give someone a link to that document, and then when they pull it down, we actually get that full absolute path of where that document's coming from, and we can defer the tenancy information from that. And then from there, we can, again, only pull data from that one specific tenant. So that's kind of the approach we took. We also wanted to take an approach of keeping this very generic. I could spend all day trying to come up with the reports that I think are useful, but in the end, a user is typically going to want to do their own types of reporting. Interestingly, I had a guy that, he may be in here, but I had a guy over in the office booth stop me. He saw the application, and he was like, I run a help desk, and you know what? My biggest challenge is reporting. And so, again, I think the approach that we took here was, let's just give someone the raw data, and then they can use the charts in Excel that they want. And so that's kind of the approach that you want to jump over to me.
Yep. Yeah, and one of the other things on that front was the drop-down that you see in the report itself is actually just our web service method. So what we decided to do is, if we actually made the views generic, we can always just add more views to the drop-downs, and then they are actually just making the generic calls, grabbing the results, and then formatting those results into an Excel table that we can actually use for further BI. So it's basically just taking JSON and actually formatting that into the Excel table object for further analysis.
So I'm going to go here to the statistics tab. And what you'll see is we're going to load some charts. These charts are actually, we decided there were two that would be really nice to provide all users, some really kind of high-level things. So I can look at the past 7 days tickets, both tickets created and tickets closed, and then tickets over lifetime, the distribution by day of the week. And so you can tell that this is a demo environment. I don't have the best-looking charts here, but ultimately these are just a starting point. What we really want people to do is use this Analyze in Excel button. So when I go in and I click on this Analyze in Excel button, you can see at the bottom it's saying, do you want to open up this Excel document? And if you look, it's coming from our app web. That location there is actually the app web of our application. So I'll go ahead and open this guy. And again, because it lives there, I'm only going to be able to pull in tenant information specific to me. And so you can see here, we give you raw data in two forms. You can get ticket data, or you can get survey data. So I could come here and say, let me grab maybe the last 2 months worth of tickets, and I will pull them back by maybe tickets by day. And when I click Get Tickets, it's just going to bring in that raw data, and then I can go and report on this any way I want. If I wanted to put a chart on it, if I wanted to use another app possibly from the app marketplace, I can do all that within here.
And again, this is another place where it was super easy to actually build this in Excel. If we took the approach of, hey, we've got to generate reports for each type of report that they need, it's a lot more complex. But if we took the approach of, all we have to do is actually create a view and have a link to that view and let them easily pull that into Excel, this code here ends up being really a minimal amount of, it's an HTML page with 2 JavaScript functions in it. So it's a very simple app, but it actually really adds benefit to the overall application itself.
Another cool thing about this, for those that aren't familiar with the apps for Office, is a task pane app doesn't have to stay with the document at all. I can close this out and save this off, and I have my raw data. I can kind of act independently. It really just supports the document. It's not really a part of the document.
Yep. And then I guess the other view that we've got on that too is we use this same application, same views, for survey results. Because we thought, well, if we want to analyze the survey results that we had in our email surveys, we could actually use Excel apps for that as well. And that's what we ended up doing.
Awesome. So I wanted to leave you guys, Nathan and I have not only done a lot with this app, we've done other apps. We've been doing a lot of the Ignite trainings and traveling around the world, kind of evangelizing the app model. Over time, we've kind of come up with some of our tips that are, I would say, secret things. So I don't know about secret things, but I think additional things to consider. So a few of mine are, think about users that might navigate directly to your app. Right? It's likely that someone might save it as a favorite and just try to go directly to there instead of through SharePoint. Well, if you know how these apps work, the apps get a context token from SharePoint. So if I try to go directly to the app, I'm not going to have context. I'm not going to be able to get an access token with OAuth, and it's actually going to fail making any sort of SharePoint calls. And so we actually have a utility, and actually this is out on my blog. I have it in all my apps. Is a little utility called a context util, and what it does is, if I don't have context, there's actually a page in SharePoint it's made for redirecting to get a context token and come right back. And that's exactly what we do, is if someone tried to come right to our page, we quickly send them to SharePoint, and it comes right back. They don't even notice it at all. It's almost instantaneous. But that's something I think really important to consider. The other one is, think about authentication in different areas and what you will leverage. So as an example, when we're pulling up profile pictures, I'm not copying profile pictures into our app. I'm actually just referencing the URL of where that profile picture lives, which is probably going to be on a my site host. And that can be problematic, especially for a demo user. So most of us at Microsoft, we have like a demo tenant that we use, and we never say, keep me logged in. And what happens is, if you don't say keep me logged in, and it tries to pull a picture, and it's going to get challenged with a login screen. It's really quick, but it's enough to stop a picture from coming in. So I've seen people try to do demos that if they don't, in a real scenario, an organization, a user's going to stay logged in. But think about that when you're demoing or when you're doing your development. You want to keep that in mind. The other thing that I think is, this is kind of broad, but we did do a lot of things client side, and I think you really need to do everything that you can to prevent some sort of hack to those services. So if you're doing a predominantly UI-driven application, you really need to harden those different areas to make sure that it can't be exploited. The first time this help desk was built, not by us, the services were like wide open, and it was something that we really wanted to address when we created this. Nathan?
Yep. And so a couple other things that we noticed in kind of lessons learned on this was, in this case, we had a multi-tenant app. So when you think about your applications, think about the app install, the app uninstall, if it's departmental level, if it's going to be corporate-wide type of application. But the one thing that really kind of kept catching us was we would actually do this load of content, but what we didn't do was actually start with a tenant 0. So what ended up happening was both Richard and I would always test with one tenant, and so we'd always miss in our different filters of our views. We always would have actually bugs. So I would guesstimate that probably cost us probably in the realm of about 20 hours of debugging and fixes, just because we didn't start with a 0 tenant. So always start with actually a couple of different tenants, whether that's departments, companies, if you're doing extranet types of scenarios, kind of load multiple data in there, or actually just use the default tenant to load from, as opposed to maybe loading from the extra scripts. The other thing that we really spent a lot of time on making hardening of the services calls themselves. How can the services get called? How can we actually authenticate the user? In which context are we going to be in when we're calling this? So making sure that all that's kind of server-side calls that we did in our services. And then finally, what we the kind of last step, and we've got time. It looks like I can actually show some of this. Is really think about your publishing early on. I've noticed this actually traditionally throughout all of my development is, if developers are testing locally and kind of trying things locally, but they don't have a good mechanism for quickly developing, building, and publishing into kind of dev or test servers, you're going to end up with a lot more bugs. So really what we decided to do was invest very early on and kind of set up, okay, where's the Azure tenants we're going to publish to? In our case, we ended up publishing to 2. The product group actually, we published to theirs for release sets. And then I have an Azure tenant that I publish to for dev kind of unit testing of our stuff, just to make sure it's in the context of Azure appropriately. So whenever I do a publish of a debug set, it basically publishes out to mine. I actually have some token replacements that I do. And then for publishing a release, we go to the product teams. The product team doesn't like it very much when we actually publish buggy code out to them. So we hear it actually late at night sometimes.
I think it's a really good point there. And those are going to be really exclusive to provider-hosted apps. And I think provider-hosted, especially for, I sounded like a lot of you guys were an on-prem shop. If you have on-prem SharePoint, you're probably going to be doing provider-hosted apps, right? Because the auto-hosted ones, auto-hosted, super easy to deploy, and it automatically creates everything for me, but it's not really a capability of on-premise SharePoint deployments yet. We might have that in the future, but as of right now, it's not going to be there.
So kind of the last thing that we'll show is I'll go ahead and actually show kind of what we ended up doing from a publishing standpoint, just to make sure that you guys are aware of how it can actually do token replacements and what we do. All right, so if you look at the application, we've got, like I said, actually a couple different applications in here. So we have the Help Desk app, that's our SharePoint app. If we publish that to SharePoint, we actually want to publish that. So I'll go in and actually hit Publish. And so you see in here that this is actually an application. You pick which profile it is. So I have an Office Development Publishing profile, and this is actually going to do which secret keys I need. Then I've got what hosting. So this basically tells you where that application is going to be hosted. On-premise is going to be your server that's hosting on as soon as you publish it. So what ends up happening is as soon as I publish that Office app, it will do token replacement for my client ID, my secret, so that I can pass security and context. It also does the redirections. So anything that I'm redirecting the Excel app, I'm redirecting the email apps, those all get overridden when I actually hit the publish button on each of these guys. So then it actually does a recap of everything that's going to replace once I publish it. So the other thing that we do, so each of the Office apps, SharePoint and the Office apps actually do the exact same thing. We didn't have to publish actually the Excel one because it's part of our SharePoint publishing. So that actually just gets published automatically with SharePoint. The other one that we do is the publishing of our Azure applications. And I showed this in my other session that a few of you guys went to. But I want to show you something I didn't get to show in that session. So one of the things that I do here, so again, I've got my IntDev help desk. That's my Azure instance. And then I have the SP help desk, which is the one you guys saw if you went to our Office floor show in the foundation. That's where their Azure is. So we publish it to them, and that's how we actually get that one out there. Also, what's nice about Azure, though, especially the Azure websites, is as soon as you create a website, you can download the publishing settings, and it configures all this for you. So all you have to do is create one website for yours, one website for development, download the publishing settings, everything's configured for you. You're good to go. Just import the publishing. But then what you're looking on here is also the database. So what database gets replaced? So you'll have a dev database, you'll have a debugging or a system test database, and then you'll have production databases. And those should be actually linked to your profiles for publishing as well. So set up all your profiles early, and then you can actually very easily figure out, do we want to publish a database? Do we actually just want to have that script available? And there's a checkbox in here for update database. So we can actually publish code without publishing database, or we could always publish database and publish post scripts as well. So it's really super easy to get new changes out there very quickly in both of and actually in all three of our environments for this. So again, we do previews, and then we can actually just hit publish, and it goes. It takes a few seconds. If I publish and refresh the Azure site, it takes about 5 seconds, 10 seconds. If I publish with the database, it takes about 20 seconds or so to actually refresh the data. It wipes it out, though, on the database refresh, the way I've got it set up. But one other thing to show you is in the web configs down here, there's a web config, a debug config, and a release config. I really like using the transforms down here. So you see those transforms. Basically, any keys that are in your web configs, you can use transform settings to target each environment that you've got. So it makes it very easy to actually set up debugging, set up test servers, set up production servers, and it transforms all the keys or any other settings that you have for each of the environments that you've got. So it's a really nice addition to that we've made to the .NET framework.
So, what we wanted to accomplish during this session was to discuss some complex challenges. Again, things like tenancy, things like securing services. We wanted to demonstrate some advanced patterns and practices for these types of apps, and hopefully illustrate a solution that leverages the full breadth, right, even all the way into the Office application. So I hope we achieve that with you guys. I do want to point out some related content. All of these are in the past. So you can go back and watch those if we were doing things that were over your head or want to get more of some of the background on some of these other approaches like auto-hosted apps. You can see there's some information here, including hands-on lab. It says on here, find us later at the Mod Booth Garage or Ask the Experts. You'll probably have a better bet of catching us at the airport later. And then I put my blog. Nathan could probably share his. I have lots of big solutions out on my blog, like Kudos and things like that, and doing Azure Media Services with SharePoint apps. So there's some neat things out there, and I'd encourage you guys to go out and check that out.
Yeah, and so we've got a few minutes left. Again, we've got 2 custom brand templates for those of you that joined us late. So with bind tuning, there's actually a site where you can actually go out there, configure custom branded templates, and download them and import them into your SharePoint environments. So we got 2 of those to give away. So we purposely didn't show a lot of code in this because there's a lot of code to it. We're looking at getting legal approval to release this code. So we're going through that kind of steps now. But if you have any kind of questions or if you want to see specific things in the code, feel free to ask or come up and check with us later. So any questions that for free templates?
Got one in the back.
So if you publish this to the store and a person on-premise downloads it and doesn't have OAuth, how would you handle that? How would you go about kind of setting it up for OAuth and not having it?
That's a good question. So from a store perspective.
Repeat the question.
So yeah, okay. So the question was is if this goes out to the store and someone that's on premise wants to pull down this application and be able to use it, but doesn't have the trust set up with ACS, how would they be able to do that? So it's my understanding that if you do not have the ACS trust with us, those will not show up in the store. You won't have the ability to pull down those provider-hosted apps. Now, this is kind of another pattern that I do recommend is that for those that are unfamiliar, if I don't do OAuth with ACS, so if I do apps on premise without using ACS for OAuth, it's actually not OAuth at all. We do what's called a high trust server-to-server handoff. And what this means is instead of doing all the OAuth stuff, I basically use certificates. So my app has a private key, and SharePoint Farm is going to have the public key. And what I end up doing is I am going to sign all my communication from my app with that private key that then SharePoint can decode and use. So the interesting thing about that, we haven't really got into this, but hopefully somewhere during the week you saw something called Token Helper. Nathan might be able to pull up Token Helper in code, but anytime you create an app for SharePoint, either an auto-hosted or a provider-hosted, part of the template is this big CS file that's called Token Helper, and it does a lot of things. And one of the things is it can deal with those S to S calls. S to S is actually way simpler than OAuth is. So I think it's a best practice as you build your apps to make sure that you are checking for context. You can go, and if you do not have a context token, it could be that this is a S2S example. And so if I don't have a context token, there's an alternate way that I can get access to SharePoint. So there's another call in the token helper. I don't know if, let me see if I can zoom out here and try to mess up your code here, Nathan.
Go ahead.
But there is, under token helper, there is get access token, get S2S access token with Windows identity. So I could actually get my context two different ways. I can get my context if I'm using OAuth, or I can get my context if I'm doing S2S. And you don't necessarily have to rewrite your app depending on which way you're going. You just need to put a check in there, and hey, if it's this way, get my context one way. If it's not, get my context the other. But at some point, they might have those in the store, but my understanding is if you don't have the ACS trust, they're not going to have those available.
And some of the patterns that we see is, yeah, that's right, is basically they get it either way, whether it's S2S or, and it's a fairly easy thing to kind of put that switch in there. Other question over here?
Yeah, I have a question about that phone control.
Uh-huh.
Would it be possible built into your app, the building for the look and feel for the original tenant, basically come into your app so that, suppose there's that tenant was working on a pre-built instance, right?
Yep.
And, they can distinguish just visually which help desk system they were in versus having this one.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Is you absolutely can. I mean, it will take on. First of all, the Chrome control will. But if you're referencing the styles from the host site, you absolutely can take on like the colors and brand. That's actually what we attempted to do in V2 of our UI. And what we started to see is that I'm not saying that the Chrome control is bad, but we had challenges doing things like our responsive design. It started to not look the way we wanted to, and there's a lot of real estate that we felt like it was using at the top. And to be quite honest, we felt like Help Desk was a brand. We could do that. But actually, I might have an example of that for you here. Let me go back to my developer site. So you see that I have this like kind of black theme site in here. I don't know that I have this installed. Let's see. I built a little weather app.
Or what about that one you did for Garage?
What's that?
The Garage one didn't have Chrome control?
Oh, yeah, sure, we could do that. Social sentiment. So you can see here the Chrome control is that black color, but what I was looking for is I actually did there's a lot of like weather widgets out there that are built in the new app model, but I made my weather tile. I pulled in the same tile color as the main screen. So, if you had a black theme, you had black weather widget. If you had a blue theme, you had a blue weather widget. And yeah, that's absolutely something that you can do in your app. I think the key is just importing. Actually, you don't have to import styles. The Chrome control brings the styles automatically for you. So,
and I think that's actually a good strategy too for internal apps where there's multiple departments that might not want to have, their basically look and feel kind of come through on the app as well. I think that's a good strategy for that as well. Any other questions? And sorry, the first, I can't tell. Is that a Microsoft shirt that you're wearing? No. Okay. All right. Yeah, and so you two, afterwards, why don't you come up and I'll give you codes for those custom branded sites if you want.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
What sort of JavaScript libraries do you guys prefer when you're building apps?
Yeah, it's a good question. So this particular application that we did, the only other JavaScript library we used outside of jQuery was the chart controls. And the reason why we did that is we have to get legal approval on each library for this particular example. Because we were looking at potentially giving it out or using it for reference design. There's a lot of other great libraries out there. There's a ton of good controls. The actual bind tuning, the templates that we're giving out, they're actually using Twitter Bootstrap libraries for a lot of the themes and whatnot as well. But there's a lot of different types of libraries out there to use.
Yeah, we toyed with a few different ones. Obviously, jQuery's there. That's part of the templates now in SharePoint, and we actually host jQuery on our CDN network. So, but beyond that, we did a lot of the development.
Yeah, we did all. Yeah.
And to be quite honest, I haven't found, like for responsive, I haven't really found one that I have. They seem great at like swapping out pictures, but beyond that, they didn't feel like they helped me that much. So we did most of it on our own.
Yeah.
What was your other question?
Now with your app part and your responsive design, do you have to do a cross-domain call to actually get that to resize because it's an app part?
That's correct. That's built into the API. I don't know that I have some examples on my blog of doing it, but I think it's documented on MSDN. But basically, anytime I need to do cross-domain calls, we use it's a HTML5 thing, the post message API, and basically the concept behind it is I'll call the iframe the child. Is the content in the child can post a message out to the parent, and the parent can choose to ignore it, right? The parent doesn't have to listen. So that's the security part of it, is it's only going to listen for certain things that are coming from certain places. And so here's an example. So we can do things like resize an app part. Another really good example of one is, I'll take you to a SharePoint site that I built an app for provisioning sites here. So if I go to sites and say add new site, what you see here is actually, and got a lovely JavaScript error. Let's try that again. I'm not sure what was going on with that. There we go. Yeah, pictures aren't coming in. But this is actually an app for provisioning sites. It's in a dialog. Well, I want to be able to close the dialog from within my app. So again, we use post message for that. If I want to close, dialogs. Actually, there's two of them. There's one for close dialog and refresh, or close dialog without refresh. So those are some of them. To be quite honest, I've had to hunt through some of the JavaScript libraries to discover all of them. But post message allows us to do cross-domain from one window to another. Yeah.
So how much work did you do to get this compatible with IE7, IE8, or if any at all?
Well, we didn't test IE8. IE8 is what we target because IE8 is what SharePoint targets. So we probably wouldn't go to IE7, although you could. I think we had someone at Ask the Experts, and they were actually using IE7 with 2013, but it's not really a supported scenario. So us as Microsoft, we go with what's kind of the supported scenarios. In our case, this really was meant for kind of reference design. So we didn't do a lot of backwards testing. We tested with other browsers. We didn't test with probably IE8 just because we don't have easy access to an IE8 browser.
Well,
Yeah.
Yes,
Someone
ma'am.
else?
Any gotchas with regards to your mail apps on a mobile device, size-wise?
Yeah, size is kind of a challenge. So we definitely kind of made sure that UI and logic kind of fit within the sizing of the applications. On the mail apps, what we tell everyone is test it with every form factor that you're wanting to consume it with. So not just in the web browser, but test it in the thick client as well, and then across any browsers that are going to actually consume that mail app as well. We kept a very simple, you notice the UI in our mail apps are very simple, and actually, and on the status one was consistent with our other ones. We didn't have to do a lot of retesting other than just kind of fitting and sizing, which, like I said, was kind of a challenge because that's a fairly small window. And also depending on kind of where the browser was at, you have to kind of take that into account because the mail apps shouldn't have scroll bars really wherever possible. So I think there was some. Yeah, go ahead.
I found out that a user can only add an application a single time in one website. Any reason why?
Any reason why a user would add?
So
you're thinking like in a situation like maybe having list data, or what? Give me an example of.
I think I know what it is.
Like, for example, your application can only be installed on a single SharePoint site once.
Yep. Yeah. So the reason why is it's kind of the architectural decision of how apps are architected is when you create an app. Let's say it's called Help Desk. It creates the app web. When you go to an app web, you get this weird looking domain, but what it really is just a sub-site underneath that site with the name of the app. Well, if I add the app twice, that site's already there. It couldn't, it would have a conflict. And so that's just the decision Microsoft chose to go with how they wanted to do the isolation model for these apps. Because of it, we can't provision more than one because there would be, the biggest one is we would have this issue with conflict with the app webs. Now, there's an interesting thing in the app model called, if you're familiar with feature stapling, you can actually app staple. So for my app catalog, I can go in the app catalog and I can push out my app to every team site if I wanted to, or every site under a certain managed path. And actually, when you do that, it only creates an app web in the app catalog. And so in those cases, maybe in the future, we might support two, but again, it would be pure speculation. I mean, I think the key is that app web is, I think, the boundary right now because of that.
Yeah. So you're really stuck adding multiple web parts or multiple app pages or folders within that one app. We've got time for one more, but we'll be around afterwards, so you guys can certainly come up. Last question? Yep.
That's actually on our. We had horrible scope creep in this app. I mean, this thing started out.
Yeah,
you saw our data model.
We had two screens originally.
We had like 3 tables to begin with, and now it's like huge. So that's actually was on our list, and it probably in V2 will be there. We thought that would be fantastic to do a link integration.
Yeah, so Richard and I working together is a terrible combination because we were like, oh, it'd be cool if we did this. So. Yeah. And then having the PM that we were working with as well, he threw in his own fair share of scope creep as well. So, yeah. Cool. Well, we got to wrap it up and kind of shut down here, but we're just heading to the airport later tonight, so you guys feel free if you need to stick around and ask any more questions. For the guys that, for the templates, if you guys come up, I've got your template codes on my phone, so I can give you those. All right. Thanks a lot, guys.
Appreciate it.